I'm going to cover some identity fundamentals, really focusing on cloud identity, some of the infrastructure components, how to sign into things, why a single identity is so important, which was a great introduction. And I really love this slide. I'm sure if you've ever seen a presentation on identity or anything else, this one really likes to hop in and kind of show you how complex it can be. And hopefully today we can kind of simplify some of those components. And it really is a universal platform for Azure Active Directory. And we tend to talk about Azure in a number of different facets and a number of different capabilities. But this is really kind of think of it as identity as a service. It's cloud hosted. It integrates with your on-prem Active Directory, but there's a lot of components here. And identity is who you are. It's your persona in the cloud. It allows you to access different components, but it can be really, really, really complicated. And the cool thing here is hopefully we'll provide some clarity, allow you to kind of understand some of the ways that, especially from like signing into devices that are Intune joined or using SaaS applications in the cloud like M365, Office 365, but also using it for all of your third-party apps too. And there are a lot of really cool capabilities that come in when you actually integrate your third-party applications in. And I know there are other sessions on security, but one of the big components for identity and having a strong identity backbone and an infrastructure is one of those security components, and we can reduce risk. We can do constant validation and checking on how you actually access and if you're authorized to access certain applications. One of the key components for it is, and for identity, is authentication. There's authorization, and then we'll get into some of the other controls and components and actually capabilities of Azure Active Directory. So I'm going to just briefly kind of cover here a few of the components on how we can have seamless single sign-on, some of the capabilities and some of the ways that you can actually set up your infrastructure if you do have an on-prem or a private cloud, and you're not just going to connect directly from one cloud service to another, which is a capability that we will be talking about. It's always really important to kind of bring this up, especially as we talk about devices, hybrid devices and hybrid identity really facilitates and means that we're synchronizing our identity, our users, our groups, our devices into the cloud. One of the core components that we have there is Azure Active Directory Connect. And Azure Active Directory Connect is the sync engine that really pulls and copies not only the user data and the metadata that's associated with it, so you can do really cool things like dynamic groups, build out a very seamless way to manage group memberships and handle that, as well as, like I said before, the devices. When we move into the cloud and we start using the cloud for authentication, we gain some really great features. Multifactor authentication, probably one of the strongest components and one of the strongest capabilities that we have to preventing and being a more secure environment. So as we look at that and as we facilitate a cloud identity, we want to make sure that it's secure. We want to make sure that it's also simple. So single sign-on and having one set of credentials, or even going passwordless, which is a capability that we'll talk about a little bit later on, really helps facilitate this whole infrastructure and the capabilities that you have kind of in a cloud or a hybrid environment. So one of the configurations that we have for synchronizing Azure Active Directory Connect that is a passive authentication and a very secure one, a little bit more secure than ADFS, is pass-through authentication. So we have our on-prem environment. You as a user have your set of credentials, but we're going to still sign in and authenticate directly against the cloud. And so what that does is it actually uses an agent that's on-prem that does its own certificate and encryption failover and rollover to look at a service on the back end of Azure Active Directory and validate that the credentials or your username and password that you signed in is the same one that matches your on-prem environment. So this is a passive service. All of the authentication and actually all the traffic, even though the arrows show that it's going back to on-prem, this pass-through authentication agent is actually only outbound. And so just like the checkboxes here, what it really does is it goes through and it synchronizes up with Azure Active Directory and then goes in and says, do you have the right username and password? And then it says thumbs up or thumbs down, and that's all outbound traffic. So for users that are a little bit more concerned, or your security team is a little bit more concerned about putting password hashes in the cloud, like the second option here, a password hash synchronization, that's a really viable option for seamless single sign-on capabilities. Pass-through authentication is certainly a very popular and very secure component. Not as popular as actually password hash synchronization. So one of the cool features and capabilities with password hash synchronization, it's built right into Azure Active Directory Connect, and it synchronizes a different hash. So it does a salting operation and does some other encryption techniques where it goes ahead and puts a different hash in there that's salted over 1,000 times. So salting is a randomization mechanism built into the service where it sends a different hash in. Azure Active Directory knows how to decrypt that hash so that when you do sign in, you're using the same password. But from a security standpoint, the hash that you have and the hash that you're authenticating against Azure Active Directory with can't be stolen. So in a pass the hash situation, or so some of the other hacking techniques, you can't actually take that hash and go and authenticate against the on-prem environment because it is different. So really cool capabilities here, really popular and very, very easy to set up. Like I said, it's built right into Azure Active Directory Connect. Whenever we're talking about synchronizing components, it's also important to think about, what you're sending to the cloud. And in a lot of cases, organizations, especially institutions, actually don't synchronize their whole directory. They should, though. We should be synchronizing our devices. Maybe we don't synchronize all of our groups because we have some cloud-based groups. We want to do some administration and have some different group types that don't exist on-prem in the cloud. So we hold some of those up back. That's okay. But we really do want to synchronize all of our users and as many devices as we can to the cloud to give you that seamless single sign-on and the best user experience possible. Our next option here and configuration is kind of not necessarily an old one. It's been around for quite a while, but federation services, which is a service within server configuration, as well as in some cases you can actually use federation for other third-party authentication services. We're not going to really get into those today. This is a Microsoft-focused training and education on Azure Active Directory, but know that in some cases you can use a third party to sign in and do federation versus using ADFS. We recommend ADFS, especially from a seamless single sign-on capability, as well as some of the Intune registration components require a WS Trust or WS Fed if you are federating. So just keep that in mind if you're doing federation. Understand that, especially if you want to do device management or use hybrid devices and have kind of the best experience possible, probably going to recommend that you would go with ADFS versus using a third party. There are some advanced configurations there to actually pivot ADFS and use that with a third-party authentication service. And that's called IDP chaining. So a lot of configuration capabilities. ADFS has been around for a really long time. It continues to be a supported functionality and capability that we have, but just know that there are other configuration options. And we started with two of them that are more cloud first, cloud aware, give you a better user experience than ADFS, but ADFS and federation is still a configuration option that is available for Azure Active Directory. And then kind of bringing it all together, there are hybrid options. So we can do federation and have the hashes go into the cloud. And when we get into some of the configuration and security capabilities, having those hashes in the cloud, having Azure Active Directory aware of what those passwords are a really, really strong capability for, dark web lookups, for us to be able to detect if the password itself has become compromised, recommending that users change their password. You can mix in pass-through authentication if you have some more secure accounts. So you can actually blend how users and how different user groups sign in and authenticate. One of the most popular ones that we see on the education side is, especially in higher education, is that maybe the staff and faculty use pass-through authentication because, the organization doesn't necessarily want the sign-ins to be authenticating directly against the cloud. They want that pass-through capability and that lookup from an on-prem standpoint. But for our students, we're just going to use password hash. It's a little bit easier. Some of the self-service capabilities are a little bit more capable, but we can blend how users are signing in one Azure Active Directory, which makes it a pretty dynamic environment, very capable, as well as mixing some of the federation capabilities in if you were looking to do that. So you can have users in one tenant signing in different ways. It's a pretty cool capability. And so when we look at choosing the right authentication, it kind of builds out as this logic matrix of do you want cloud authentication with password protection? Yes. Do you have authentication that's an authentication requirement that's not natively supported by Azure Active Directory? That's when we're moving into federation, like I was talking about. There's other capabilities there, and so when we look at that, obviously we're starting with the most capable and the easiest to set up and configure, which is the password hash sync with seamless single sign-on. Moving into federation with password hash sync. Again, do you want to be able to look for leaked credential reports, pull up some of those more secure capabilities? If so, then we recommend synchronizing the password hashes. And then, do you need cloud-based auth? You want to do leaked credentials? Then we're moving into pass-through authentication. Pass-through authentication as well supports that seamless single sign-on. Hopefully, in the Intune presentation, they kind of walked you through and showed you what that seamless single sign-on experience is. I think it's, especially for education environments, I think it's kind of a game changer because of the capabilities of signing into the device once and not having to sign in multiple times to access cloud resources or access applications that are authenticating and authorizing through Azure Active Directory. Very, very, very powerful and really capable kind of configuration components. So, just like I said, we always lead with the password hash sync. Second, we really like to go through and use pass-through authentication. And the big reason there is in those first two bullet points, it is really that seamless single sign-on capability. And then third, if we can't go through and we can't configure or we can't set up those capabilities, or for some reason you have a third-party authentication provider, then you're going to be looking to use, federation and some documentation, because all of these presentations are online. Just really want to walk you through those capabilities and for you to be able to discover for yourself which option is going to be right for you. Now we're going to move into conditional access, and in the identity world, authorization. So one of the core pillars of identity and access management, one is authentication. We just kind of walked through how we can do that in Azure Active Directory. The next is actually authorization. So are you able, or do you have the right permissions and rights to be able to access these resources? So if we talk about protected third-party applications or more secure documentation, encrypted documents. We can do it in a just-in-time manner, which is a really cool capability as you're moving from one application to another, or as you're opening up another document or accessing a different place within M365 to step up that level. And it kind of breaks into a few different kind of components here. We pull lots of telemetry, and I'm sure you'll see how many signals and how much we pull in on a daily basis in the security presentation, but we're pulling tons of signals across our whole client access front end, or a cafe service, if you will, which is kind of that authentication and identity and access management side, to understand where you're trying to sign in from, what application you're trying to access, real-time risk calculations, things like impossible travel, unknown device, all pulls in and provides signals when you're actually authenticating, when you're signing in, to say, hey, are you allowed to access this? Are we going to step up and then ask you for multifactor authentication? Are we going to restrict access? And that comes into some of our cloud app security and application proxy components to say, yes, you're able to access it, but since it's not an organizationally owned device, I'm not going to allow you to download anything to it. You can use the web applications to update Word or update an Excel spreadsheet, make a PowerPoint, but you can't download it to your personal device because it's protected. And then, of course, we can block access, right? And this all sits in front of those applications and the data that you're trying to access. So whether it's an Azure function, whether it's documents, whether it's a third-party application, all things that we take in. And this is a core pillar as well for zero trust. And it's one of our core principles there. And so we never trust an authentication request. We are always verifying that user is where they're supposed to be, accessing things they're supposed to be. And if they aren't, we're going to block it or we're going to restrict it. And those are all configurable for you and for your organization. So that's one of the really cool capabilities here is we're giving you all the signals, we're giving you all of the data. You get to verify the access attempts and validate the access attempts in policies that you create in conditional access. So again, we're giving you the knowledge and we're giving you the capabilities to look at those sign-ins, look at the devices, set those requirements based on your organizational policies and enforce them, and always be verifying that people are doing the right things or there's not something nefarious going on. So we look at conditional access and then we start pairing it with the identity protection, which is some of those real-time lookups, and we use an evaluation engine as well as some machine learning to give you those controls. Again, if you kind of look at the left side of the screen, those are all things that we take into account, and those are all the conditions and the scenarios that you have to then go ahead and apply your policy to the conditional access set and then enforce controls. And so the right-hand side is where, in the middle is where you're setting your policy, but on the right-hand side is where you see that policy taking effect, right? We look at, controlling cloud apps, SaaS applications, API access, even down to accessing on-prem applications, web apps, mobile apps, and of course, our cloud as well. So when you look at the security, Azure Active Directory is a huge pillar of our security platform. Again, it's the backbone. Identity is who we are. That's how we present ourselves, and that's how we validate and verify that we are who we say we are when accessing applications. And when we combine that with other security components, it becomes a very, very comprehensive capability. I've touched on Intune a few times. One of the coolest signals, I think, at least when I was in the field and working with academic institutions, and I still do on the engineering side, but is using the Intune signal and having a device that is a compliant device. It's up to date. It hasn't been rootkitted. It's using a trusted and assigned and verified version of the operating system. It has BitLocker enabled. All of those signals come in Intune to be a compliant device. And so we take all of those components into account. And just like I was talking about with the device and being able to download things, those are capabilities that we have when we use a solid security foundation and a solid security background. So really cool capabilities. Again, it kind of brings together a solid and industry-leading security posture that is really kind of rooted within that zero trust framework. And all of these pull and create a ton of data and a ton of signals. And so when you're looking at aggregating all of this, trying to understand it, we of course got to talk about Azure Sentinel that gives you and your security ops team a really industry leading and cloud native SIEM that helps them, focus on the important things. It does a lot of machine learning and analytics to pull out and source relevant alerts and relevant data so that you can get to the root of the problem, or you can discover what's actually happening faster than trying to go to each one of these individual portals, look at the logs, and try and aggregate that on yourself or for yourself. So when we look at the cloud app security side, again, I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit, but again, we talk about session risk. That's a data calculation that we do based on where you're signing in from, device is managed or unmanaged, and we take in and look at all of these sign-in and configuration components and say, hey, that device is unmanaged. That's okay, but they normally sign in from Red Bank. They're in the marketing group. They last signed in 3 hours ago. They're now signing in again from the same location. So we're going to go ahead and take that and apply a cloud app security session to accessing third-party applications. In this example, we're using Box for data and storage. So we're going to send them through a different session capability. It looks just like Box. It's just we're the URL on the front end that then is going to give you the capabilities to do things like block downloads, restrict access to protected files and information. We, of course, always do this as well with our applications, as well as a lot of other third-party applications. And that integration continues to grow and get stronger as we continue to work a lot more with our partners and our relationships that are there. So as you can see, somebody's trying to access a spreadsheet or a document, but it's going to be protected. They still get to access that information. They still get to edit that as they need to and consume that as that user. And it's in all of these calculations and these components. There's really no delay to the end user. This is all calculated in real time. It's a very large server infrastructure on the back end that really helps and strengthen and increase that quality of service and time to receive and access information. And if you're not going to go into the full Sentinel side, when we look at our security side and we look at conditional access, we have a really good reporting dashboard that shows you, which applications are protected, which ones are not, user populations of who has policies assigned to them, who doesn't. We can, one of the coolest capabilities, I think, when we set these policies up, I would never go ahead and turn a policy on, but what it's going to let you do is it'll let you to turn on a policy in report only mode. And when you're in report only mode, it's going to tell you who would be triggered or if that policy would be triggered on a user sign in or on a user event, so that we're testing the behavior and validating that behavior and that policy is behaving how we want it to, and the user experience is detrimented or impacted. We're just augmenting that. So another really cool capability there, be able to test things, investigate if things aren't behaving correctly, really tune those policies before we actually enforce them or enable them. We do actually have quite a few templates as well. These are our recommendations. You can use them if you so choose. We do have a lot of organizations that use our baseline policies and our conditional access templates as a starting place to go in and, strengthen their security posture. And it's a faster deployment because these are vetted and qualified configuration and templates. So a little bit of a faster time to deploy, but solid templates for you to start off with. And give yourself a really simplified experience when starting off with conditional access. From an identity and access management, if you were to create a brand new tenant today, security defaults is actually on by default. Funny. But if you have an older tenant, this may not be something that's on in your tenant. You can turn it on, but we see 92% of our customers actually, once they have it turned on, or the new customers that come in and it is on, they stay opted into security defaults because it turns on things natively like stronger multi-factor authentication. It's going to pull in a lot of those baseline configurations and controls. MFA is a huge one for this. And what we see with that is sometimes, people don't have MFA registered, or, they haven't had a chance to set up and configure it, or you have a new tenant and you need to access something, or somebody loses the capability to access certain things. They don't have their phone on them, or their token, their FIDO token, or what have you. There's a capability called temporary access pass. So if you set up passwordless, it's a very strong recommendation for anybody that is an admin to actually transfer over and start using anything that's got privileged access to passwordless. Really strong capabilities there that allow you to access things without actually even having a password anymore. I transitioned myself over to this a few months ago. Works exceptionally well. It's very seamless for both my personal accounts and my corporate Microsoft account, but just really, really cool capabilities there. But in the event that you have misplaced your validation device or your authenticator, you have the capability to actually go in and use a temporary access password that can, be a one-time login event that allows you to re-register a device. And as well, this is a great way to onboard new customers, or even in some cases where they have capabilities, students, because you can create a temporary password for them. They set up, they register. This is more for a higher education than K through 12. I don't know many kids in elementary school that have cell phones, but the capability here allows a pretty solid and a comprehensive onboarding process for disseminating and distributing passwords to students in a secure manner, where it isn't just a standard password or a generic random generated one that's sitting in a database somewhere. So really cool onboarding capabilities for this. Seeing a lot of traction in the United States for this, for like I said, a lot of higher ed institutions. Now we're going to get into kind of one of the things that I think gets really neglected on the education side, and that's lifecycle management. And then we'll talk a little bit about third-party app integration as well. So when we go through and start looking at connecting third-party applications and configuring those, there's a number of different ways to pull in, obviously, identities. In the beginning, we talked about pulling them in through Azure Active, or from Active Directory, using Azure Active Directory Connect into Azure AD. But if you're using a more modern HR system for your internal staff like Workday or SAP, you can connect that actually directly to Azure Active Directory as well. And then it allows you to do real-time provisioning and quick provisioning of user accounts when they're created. So when you're onboarding a new employee, provisioning that user account, getting them access to those components. It works actually two ways, right? Because if it's provisioning into work from Workday, you're also then going to be publishing that app into Azure Active Directory, which is then the authentication provider for your HR systems, something that we strongly recommend you have some sort of multi-factor authentication on, and so putting that behind Azure Active Directory as a application, very strong posture, very cool capabilities that are there. There are other ways to pull in. My colleague Dan Baumgartner will be talking about, or if he hasn't already, we'll be talking about student data sync. So that's another way to pull in information or pull in users from a student information system. But we can pull users in for external identities from other applications and other providers like G Suite, other Azure Active Directories. So you can also give access to applications, documents, your M365 environment to third parties, to contractors, to people in other organizations, so that you can securely share and collaborate on documents, on applications, and be a more productive and more secure environment. As well as, I haven't touched on this yet, Azure Active Directory Application Proxy is a very popular configuration option as well as our third-party network appliances and app controllers to allow on-prem applications to be serviced in a cloud-based manner that allows you to present on-prem web applications and use Azure Active Directory as the authentication provider, as well as that security front end for your on-prem applications. So as we look at the identity lifecycle, again, we can use, cloud HR components. And one of the really cool capabilities that we have here is if you terminated somebody or you shut off access or terminated an employee from one of those cloud HR systems, that can trigger a user termination where they're going to go ahead and deactivate the actual user account. You can set resignation dates. And this joiner, mover, leaver process, I think one of the things that we need to get better on in education, especially as we look at it from a security standpoint, is that leaver process. As students graduate or as we transition year over year, back to school being the reason we're all here today, you're going to have students that are no longer active, and that leaver process or removing their access is something that I don't think we're the best at in education, especially when we have students for life and some of these other capabilities and things that we service in the education industry. But understanding that, removing access is as important, if not more important, than granting somebody access. And so when we're cleaning up our Azure Active Directory environment or removing legacy accounts or dead accounts that, so to speak, in our Azure Active Directory, we're making it a stronger environment all up. So when we have identity lifecycle management, when we really kind of talk about that, there's kind of three key scenarios. We're going to provision users from HR systems or cloud systems into Azure Active Directory, provisioning applications being that second scenario, to really any application that you have in your organization, whether they're non-Microsoft Cloud apps, whether they're Microsoft apps, or they're on-prem apps, and understanding who should be having access to them, who shouldn't be, is a part of lifecycle management. If I moved from accounting to say, a leadership position, or move to a different department, as you transition there, we need to be dynamic in the way that people have access to those applications. And a lot of that could be done by group management or come from, telemetry and information from something like an HR system. So that's kind of a metadata component for group management and dynamic group management and access. but a really powerful capability when we look at third-party applications, who should have access, who shouldn't, and transitioning the life cycle of a user as they transition from one role to the next. Another great example is, having student workers. They're going to need, in a lot of cases, a higher level of access than a standard student, but being able to manage their group memberships in an automated manner, or by data that we're getting from some sort of provisioning system, or the source of authority is what we really like to reference that as, to say, hey, they should now have access to Salesforce, or they should have access to Power BI within Office 365 where they didn't have that before. That's one of the components of lifecycle management that is very, very important to understand, that they have the least amount of access that they should, not over provisioning them and giving them access to everything based on their job type, their role, or their persona in your organization. And then our third one, which we talk about a lot, is in a hybrid state, provisioning from on-premise, and on-premise identities, really coming from your organization today. You can connect multiple Active Directories up into one Azure Active Directory. So if you have a complicated on-prem environment, know that a lot of that can be simplified with Azure Active Directory Connect, connecting to multiple Active Directory forests, different configuration options there, so that you can get all of your users that need access or that should be in the cloud without manually provisioning them or doing something that's kind of overly complicated from a lifecycle flow and lifecycle management. And then when we look at the identity governance component, this is where we really kind of take conditional access, we take the lifecycle management component in, and we onboard a user, we give them a life cycle, and we have access reviews, and we have the capabilities for you to do auditing within Azure Active Directory to say, do these users have access? Should they still have access? We can then take that and move that into a privileged user with privileged identity management. And that's really for our administrative teams, whether we're talking about a help desk and doing password resets, all the way to global admins they're very much, kind of hold all of the keys to the M365 configuration, and something where they really shouldn't have global access all the time, or global admin access all the time, or even be able to reset passwords all the time. And that just helps you secure your infrastructure even more. There's self-attestation as a part of that, and we'll work through some of those flows here in a minute. But then, again, getting back to that one thing that I think we need to focus a bit more on from a security standpoint is our end of life cycle. And that's, deprovisioning users, blocking their ability to sign in and access applications, removing those users when they're no longer a part of the organization, or they've graduated, or are no longer at your institution. If we look at one of the configuration options that we have in Azure Active Directory, we can create custom approval workflows. And so when we talk about simple things like accessing files or accessing a SharePoint site or a team, going in and requesting access, really goes into should they have access? Who can request access? Are we going to automatically grant the access, or are we going to send a notification? And we can put that on our applications. We can put it on third-party applications. We can go right into group membership. So, setting up some of the automation controls of, I'm now in the accounting department, I need access to this application, or I'm in the marketing team and I need to be able to access our Twitter account so that I can publish things to Twitter on behalf of the organization. You can do that via group membership. You could do it directly against the application access flows. And then, you can set who can access it or who can even request it, which is a really cool capability. So probably don't want your students or certain people in your organization to be able to access that Twitter or even be able to request access for it. So you're probably going to block that. But, if they're in the right group or they have the right persona or information, they can request it. the leader of the marketing team or the manager of the marketing team can then go in and approve it or reject it. But one of the other cool capabilities here again is removing access when they're no longer a part of a group or they no longer are part of the organization, and minimizing the footprint of what they do have access to when they shouldn't be accessing them anymore. And we can do this with guest accounts as well as our local users. So again, going back to inviting a contractor in that's going to be working with you and your organization for a certain amount of time, granting them access, then going ahead and transitioning that over in and saying, okay, as this contractor account, as this guest account or external user is accessing this, we're going to approve it. And then after 6 months, they're no longer going to have access to those applications. And here's kind of where we bring the authentication, the authorization, and some of the lifecycle components kind of all together. And this comes in with not only our applications, but again, on-prem applications, third-party cloud applications, but pulling those external users, those external identities in, pulling in, your users and your organization in from an HR system, an LMS, a student information system, on-prem Active Directory, kind of bringing those all together and making Azure Active Directory really the hub in that one place to control your users and your access for all of your applications and all of your cloud applications, really kind of pulls it all together and gives you the most comprehensive look and view at, who should be accessing things, what applications they can access from on-prem. One of the really cool things about the on-prem and the Azure Active Directory app proxy or app delivery controllers and networking appliances, connecting that in, we can remove the need for a VPN. So a lot of those applications that are on-prem that are web served, that aren't necessarily using like a client application to access, or even if they are, allowing them to access that through the Azure Active Directory app proxy or a network controller is a very secure way to do it. When those connect up, they don't publish on 443, so you're minimizing your security footprint from access from unauthorized resources. And again, they have to go through Azure Active Directory and your conditional access policies and those controls to access those applications. So the goal being that it's not taxing on the end user to access the resources they need, and then it gives them a kind of a one-stop shop or one place to go ahead and see all their applications that they need to access in their organization, and that all is served through Azure Active Directory. And again, we have thousands and thousands of apps that we can actually publish and connect into, and you can leverage all of that in a single sign-on infrastructure, which is extremely powerful. So again, if we're doing seamless single sign-on, they can sign into their device, they sign in, they use like Windows Hello for Business, or they're using a FIDO key, or you're using passwordless authentication. They're signed in to not only that device then, but then into all of the applications in Azure Active Directory, and then using a policy engine and everything like that to step up and grant them access to higher privileged applications is just an organic workflow that is within the user access and the behavior. But it's all very simple and very straightforward to the end user. And I think that's one of the key things that a lot of people, especially on the IT side, tend to, I wouldn't say necessarily that they undermine the value of that, but I think that sometimes that gets lost in saying, well, we're going to keep these applications over here and it's going to use a different authentication mechanism, or it's using and connecting directly against like an LDAP server where we're not getting as much security. And then you're splitting your authentication signals and your telemetry so that the security is weakened. So there's a lot of reasons for kind of unifying and centralizing your institution on one kind of single identity platform and leveraging those capabilities and the power that's behind that, because then you're aggregating all the signals together. If you're connecting to on-prem resources, how much safer are you going to feel knowing that Azure Active Directory and the conditional access framework is protecting your on-prem applications as much as it's protecting your cloud applications? And then when we look at, managing external identities, I think one of the biggest and the strongest capabilities that we have here is really coming in and looking at it from a standpoint of external identities, whether they're an employee, a partner, or a contractor, or a customer to a certain extent. Configuring that policy engine will give you a ton of customization, but more importantly, really strengthens the whole policy and your whole infrastructure as a whole by saying, this is how we treat external identities. This is the policy that they have. We don't allow them to download things or exfiltrate data outside of our organization. But when they're in here, when we validated that they are who they say they are, they're able to access and work freely within our infrastructure. And then it's a highly collaborative environment and allows you to really leverage the full capabilities of Azure Active Directory.